The morning sun bathed the small town in golden hues as Evelyn stood by the window, her hands instinctively resting on her swollen belly. It had been 2 years since she conceived, and yet her baby remained inside her womb, refusing to come into the world. At first, she and her husband, Richard, had been overjoyed at the news of her pregnancy. After 7 years of childlessness, the arrival of a baby had seemed like a miracle. But as the months passed, joy turned to anxiety, and anxiety to despair. Evelyn had expected to give birth after 9 months, like every other woman. But when her due date came and went with no sign of labor, her world began to collapse. The doctors assured her that nothing was wrong. Her baby was alive, growing, moving inside her. But why wouldn't the child come out? Richard had been patient at first, but as the months stretched into a year and then beyond, his patience wore thin. The ridicule from his friends and family became unbearable. In their community, a pregnancy lasting more than 9 months was seen as an abomination, a curse, or even a punishment from the gods. The whispers, the pointing fingers, and the hidden smirks from the people around him were driving him mad. One evening, Evelyn sat on their bed, her heart heavy with worry. She could feel the tension in the air, the way Richard barely looked at her anymore. She watched as he sat at the edge of the bed, his back turned to her. "Richard," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Are you still angry?" Richard sighed deeply, running a hand through his short hair. "Evelyn, I'm tired. I don't understand this anymore. 2 years, Evelyn. 2 years. What kind of pregnancy lasts 2 years?" His voice was sharp, frustration dripping from every word. Tears welled in Evelyn's eyes. "I don't know either, but the doctor said." Richard turned abruptly, his eyes flashing with anger. "Doctor? Stop telling me about the doctor. The same doctor who keeps saying everything is fine? How can everything be fine when my wife has been pregnant for 2 years? Evelyn flinched. She had never seen this side of Richard before. He had always been a loving, caring husband. But now, he was slipping away from her. The man she loved was disappearing under the weight of frustration and shame. "Richard, please, we have waited this long. Let's have faith," she pleaded. "Faith." Richard laughed bitterly. "Faith won't stop people from mocking me. Faith won't make our baby come out. Faith won't stop me from losing my mind, Evelyn." Evelyn lowered her head, swallowing the lump in her throat. She knew what was coming, the words she had feared for months. "I can't do this anymore, Evelyn. I think we should separate." Her heart stopped. The room spun. She felt like the air had been sucked out of her lungs. "No, Richard. Please don't say that. We have come too far to give up now." Richard stood up, his fists clenched. "I can't be the laughingstock of this town anymore. Everywhere I go, people whisper behind my back. They say I married a cursed woman, that my wife is carrying a demon instead of a child. Do you know what that feels like, Evelyn?" Tears streamed down her face. "Richard, I love you. Please don't leave me." He looked at her, his expression torn between anger and something else, something like regret. Without another word, he stormed out of the room, slamming the door behind him. Evelyn collapsed onto the bed, sobbing into the pillow. She was losing her husband. She was losing everything. And worst of all, she still didn't know why her baby refused to come into the world. The waiting room smelled of antiseptic and fear. Evelyn sat stiffly on the chair, her hands trembling as she held her belly. The baby inside her kicked, as if responding to her distress. The doctor, Dr. Collins, sat across from her, a folder of medical reports in his hands. He adjusted his glasses, looking at her with concern. "Evelyn," he began gently, "I know you are scared, but as I have told you before, all our tests show that your baby is healthy. There is no medical reason why you haven't gone into labor." Evelyn let out a shaky breath. "Doctor, how can you say that? 2 years, doctor. Do you know what that means for a woman? My husband is on the verge of leaving me. People in my community say I am cursed. I can't live like this anymore. Dr. Collins sighed, rubbing his temples. I understand your frustration, but I strongly advise against forcing the baby out unnaturally. A cesarean section in this case could be extremely dangerous. Your body is not responding like a normal pregnancy, and I don't want to put your life or the baby's life at risk. Evelyn shook her head. Then what do I do? Just sit and wait? Wait until my husband finally leaves me? Wait until the whole town drives me out? Before Dr. Collins could respond, a sharp knock came at the door. The nurse, Linda, poked her head in. Doctor, Mr. Richard is here. He wants to speak with you. Evelyn's heart sank. Richard walked in, his face cold, his eyes void of any affection. Doctor, he said, his voice clipped. Is there any solution yet? Or should I start looking for a new wife? Evelyn's hands clenched the fabric of her dress, her body trembling. Mr. Richard, as I was explaining to your wife. Doctor, I don't want explanations, Richard interrupted. I want results. My wife has been pregnant for 2 years. That is not normal. If you can't fix this, then tell me the truth. Dr. Collins sighed again. Mr. Richard, we have run all possible tests. Your wife's body is functioning as if it were a normal pregnancy. I cannot explain why she hasn't gone into labor yet, but forcing an early delivery could be life-threatening. Richard scoffed, shaking his head. So you're saying we should just sit and wait? That is my medical advice, yes. Richard's hands curled into fists. This is useless. Completely useless, he muttered before storming out of the office. Evelyn watched him go, her heart shattering into a million pieces. Dr. Collins reached across the table, gently placing a hand over hers. Evelyn, he said softly, do you believe in fate? Evelyn wiped a tear from her cheek. I don't know anymore. The doctor hesitated before speaking again. There is someone, a woman, an elder. She does not work with science, but she has helped women in situations that medicine cannot explain. Evelyn looked up, her breath hitching. Who is she? Dr. Collins scribbled something on a piece of paper and slid it across the desk. Go to this address. Ask for Grandma Celeste. She may have the answers you seek. Evelyn stared at the paper, her heart pounding. Could this mystery woman be the key to ending her 2-year nightmare? She had nothing left to lose. She had to find out. The evening air was thick with tension as Evelyn sat by the small wooden table, her fingers absent-mindedly tracing circles on its surface. She hadn't eaten all day, her stomach too twisted with worry to keep anything down. Her husband, Richard, had barely spoken to her since their last visit to the doctor. His patience had long worn thin, and now, every word from his mouth carried a sharp edge, slicing deeper into her already wounded heart. A knock at the door startled her out of her thoughts. She turned toward it, a flicker of hope in her chest. Perhaps Richard had finally come home with a softened heart, willing to listen, willing to comfort her. But as she opened the door, her breath caught in her throat. Standing there, with tired eyes and a heavy heart, was her mother, Beatrice. My child, Beatrice whispered, reaching out to touch Evelyn's face. Oh, my poor child. Tears pricked at Evelyn's eyes as she threw herself into her mother's embrace. For the first time in months, she felt warmth. She felt safe. I had to come, Beatrice continued, pulling away to study her daughter's weary face. I heard what Richard has been saying. I heard how he treats you now. Evelyn shook her head, wiping her tears. Mama, it's not his fault. He's just frustrated. Beatrice sighed, stepping inside and closing the door behind her. Frustrated or not, a husband should never treat his wife like an enemy. And what about you? You have carried a baby for 2 years. That is not normal, my child. Have you sought other help? Evelyn hesitated. She hadn't told her mother about Grandma Celeste, the woman Dr. Collins had recommended. She hadn't even told Richard yet, for fear that he would dismiss it as superstition. Before she could answer, the front door swung open violently, slamming against the wall. Richard stood there, his face contorted in anger. His eyes flickered from Evelyn to Beatrice, and the rage in them grew. "So, this is what you've been doing? Calling your mother to my house without telling me?" Beatrice took a step forward, her eyes narrowing. "She is my daughter, Richard, and I will come here whenever I please if it means making sure she's safe." Richard scoffed. "Safe? From what?" "From her own husband." His voice dripped with sarcasm. "No, no, no. What you came here to do is feed her mind with nonsense." "Richard, please." Evelyn tried to interject, but her husband turned his furious gaze on her. "Enough, Evelyn. Enough of your excuses." He then pointed at Beatrice. "Get out of my house. Now." Evelyn gasped, stepping in front of her mother protectively. "No, Richard. Please don't do this." But Richard was already boiling with fury. "If she doesn't leave on her own, I will make her leave." Beatrice clenched her jaw, standing her ground. "You are not the man my daughter married. What happened to you?" Richard let out a bitter laugh. "What happened to me? I married a cursed woman. That's what happened." Evelyn let out a sharp breath, as if she had been physically struck. Beatrice shook her head in disbelief. "You are no longer a man, Richard. A real man stands by his wife. A real man protects her, loves her, supports her. But look at you. You've let your own frustrations turn you into a monster." Richard's hands curled into fists. "If you don't walk out of this house this instant, I swear." "Or what?" Beatrice challenged. "You will hit an old woman? Go ahead, then. Show my daughter who you have become." For a moment, there was silence. A dangerous silence. Then, without another word, Richard stormed into the kitchen. Evelyn felt her blood run cold. She knew what he was about to do. "Richard, no," she cried, running after him. But it was too late. He reemerged, holding a bucket filled with steaming hot water. Beatrice took a step back, her breath hitching. "You wouldn't dare," she whispered. Richard's eyes were wild, unrecognizable. "Get out of my house, Beatrice," he said, his voice low and deadly. "Or I swear to God, I will make you regret ever stepping foot in here." "Richard, please," Evelyn sobbed, placing herself between her husband and her mother. "Don't do this. This is not you." But Richard wasn't listening. His grip on the bucket tightened, his knuckles turning white. Beatrice took a deep breath, standing her ground. "If you do this, Richard, you will regret it for the rest of your life." A cruel smile twisted across Richard's face. "I doubt that." And before Evelyn could stop him, he flung the bucket forward. The world seemed to slow as the boiling water splashed across Beatrice's skin. A piercing scream filled the air. Evelyn watched in horror as her mother fell to the ground, her body convulsing in pain. Her hands clutched at the burning skin, her face contorted in agony. "Mama!" Evelyn shrieked, dropping to her knees beside her mother. Beatrice's breaths came in short, ragged gasps. Blisters were already forming on her arms and shoulders where the water had scalded her. Her eyes, filled with pain, looked at Evelyn, silently begging for help. Richard stood there, his chest rising and falling, his face unreadable. He had done it. Evelyn turned to him, her face streaked with tears. You're a monster," she screamed. Richard scoffed. "She deserved it. Maybe next time, she'll learn not to step into a man's house uninvited." Evelyn's entire body shook with rage. "How dare you? That is my mother." Richard smirked. "Not anymore. As far as I'm concerned, you are no longer my wife." Evelyn's breath hitched. "No, no, no, no. You're throwing me out?" Richard's eyes were cold. "Yes, Evelyn, I am. Pack your things and get out of my house. Take your useless mother with you." Evelyn stared at him, her world shattering around her. Her home, her marriage, Her love, all gone. She turned back to Beatrice, who was trembling in pain. She had to get her mother to a hospital. With tears burning down her cheeks, she whispered, "You'll regret this, Richard. One day you will regret this." Richard only shrugged, stepping aside. "I doubt that." Evelyn bit her lip, swallowing the sobs rising in her throat. She looked at her mother, gently touching her face. "Mama, I'm going to get you help." And with one final glance at the man she had once loved, she picked up her mother and left. As the door slammed shut behind her, Richard let out a long, tired sigh. "Finally," he muttered, "peace at last." But what he didn't know was that his nightmare had only just begun. The night air was cold against Evelyn's tear-streaked face as she struggled to support her mother's weak, burned body. Beatrice whimpered softly, her skin red and blistered from the scalding water Richard had thrown at her. Each step they took away from the house felt heavier than the last, as if the weight of betrayal itself was pressing down on Evelyn's shoulders. Her legs felt weak, her heart shattered beyond repair, but she couldn't afford to break down now. Her mother needed her. A few people stood outside their homes, watching curiously as Evelyn dragged her mother through the streets. She could hear the hushed whispers. "That's Richard's wife. He finally threw her out. She's still pregnant? After 2 years? That's unnatural. Serves her right. Who stays in a marriage where she isn't wanted?" Evelyn clenched her teeth. The shame was unbearable, but she kept moving. It took everything in her to flag down a taxi. The driver, an older man with graying hair, looked at her mother's injuries and gasped. "Madam, what happened to her?" "Please," Evelyn whispered, her voice barely audible. "Just take us to the hospital." The driver didn't ask any more questions. He helped her get Beatrice into the back seat and sped off towards St. Luke's Hospital. The emergency room smelled of antiseptic and despair. Nurses rushed to Beatrice's side, placing her on a stretcher as doctors barked orders. Evelyn tried to follow, but a nurse held her back. "Ma'am, you need to stay here," the nurse said. "Let the doctors do their work." Evelyn wanted to fight, to argue, but her body betrayed her. She felt dizzy, her head light from stress and exhaustion. She collapsed onto a chair in the waiting room, her hands gripping her belly instinctively. Her baby kicked inside her, a painful reminder of everything she was going through. She wrapped her arms around herself and let the tears fall freely. She had lost everything in a single night. Her home, her husband, her security. And now, she could only pray that she wouldn't lose her mother too. Hours passed before the doctor came out, his face serious. Evelyn jumped to her feet, her heart pounding. "Doctor, how is she?" she asked urgently. The doctor sighed, adjusting his glasses. "The burns were severe, but we've stabilized her condition. She will need intensive care, but with proper treatment, she will recover." Evelyn let out a shaky breath of relief. "But," the doctor continued, eyeing her with concern, "what happened to her? This kind of burn isn't an accident. Someone did this to her." Evelyn looked away, her throat tightening. She couldn't say it. She couldn't bring herself to speak Richard's name. The doctor nodded, as if he understood her silence. "I'll let you see her soon. For now, you need to rest. You don't look well." Evelyn bit her lip and nodded. Rest? She didn't know what that was anymore. As she sat back down, she reached for her phone. There was only one person left she could turn to now. Her brother, Daniel. The next morning, Evelyn sat at her mother's bedside, gently dabbing her forehead with a cool cloth. Beatrice was awake but weak. "My child," her mother whispered. "Where will we go now?" Evelyn's chest tightened. She had no answer. Before she could respond, the hospital doors swung open violently. A tall, well-built man strode inside, his presence commanding attention. His dark eyes were filled with fury, his jaw clenched tightly as he spotted Evelyn. "Where is he?" Daniel demanded. Evelyn flinched at her brother's voice. She had called him the night before, but she never expected him to arrive so soon. "Daniel, please." "Don't please me, Evelyn," he snapped, stepping closer. "I left everything I was doing and got on the first bus here when I heard what that bastard did to you and Mama." Beatrice stirred on the bed, her voice weak. "Daniel, my son, please don't do anything reckless." But Daniel wasn't listening. His hands were shaking with rage, his body practically vibrating with barely contained fury. "Tell me, Evelyn," he said through gritted teeth. "Did Richard really do this to Mama?" Evelyn lowered her gaze. "Yes," she whispered. "That was all it took." Daniel turned on his heel and stormed out of the hospital. "Daniel, wait." Evelyn called after him, rushing to her feet despite her heavy belly. She barely made it outside in time to see Daniel jumping into a taxi. "Where are you going?" she cried. Daniel's face was like stone. "To kill that son of a bitch." Evelyn's heart stopped. "No, Daniel, please. Don't do this." But Daniel was already gone. Evelyn felt her legs give way beneath her. She clutched her stomach, pain shooting through her body. A terrifying thought crossed her mind. If Daniel and Richard fought, would she lose her brother next? The streets were quiet in the early afternoon, but Daniel's rage was deafening. His fists were clenched so tightly that his knuckles turned white as the taxi sped through the city. His mind replayed the image of his mother lying weak and burnt in that hospital bed. He had always been protective of Evelyn and their mother, Beatrice, but now he felt like he had failed them. Richard had crossed the line. The taxi stopped abruptly in front of Richard's house, the house where Evelyn had spent years building a home, only to be thrown out like garbage. Daniel threw some bills at the driver without waiting for change and stormed out of the car. His blood boiled as he marched toward the front door and kicked it open with one swift motion. "Richard," he bellowed, his voice thundering through the house. Inside, Richard was lounging on the couch, drinking beer with two of his friends. They turned toward the doorway, startled by the sudden intrusion. Richard slowly sat up, his face twisting into a smirk. Well, look who's here. The hero of the family." Daniel's hands curled into fists. "Stand up, Richard." Richard took another sip of his drink and leaned back lazily. Or what? Daniel didn't hesitate. He crossed the room in 2 long strides and punched Richard across the face, sending him sprawling to the floor. Richard's friends jumped up in shock, but Daniel didn't give them a second glance. His full focus was on the coward lying at his feet. "You put your hands on my mother?" Daniel roared, grabbing Richard by the collar and hauling him up. Richard spat out blood and laughed. "I did more than that. And if your useless sister hadn't dragged her out of my house, I would have done worse." Daniel saw red. He didn't even think before his fists started flying. 1 punch. 2. 3. Each blow landed harder than the last. Richard groaned in pain, blood dripping from his nose. But Daniel didn't stop. "You think you're a man because you beat up a woman?" Another punch. "You think you're strong because you burned an old woman?" Another punch. "You threw my sister and my mother out into the streets?" One more. Richard coughed up blood, his body slumping against the floor. His friends moved to intervene, but Daniel turned his murderous glare on them. "Touch me," Daniel growled, breathing heavily, "and I will bury all of you right here." The men froze. They had never seen this side of Daniel before. Richard coughed, chuckling weakly. "So what now? You going to kill me?" Daniel grabbed him by the collar again, his voice low and deadly. "If my mother dies because of what you did to her," he whispered, "I swear on everything I have, I will kill you." Richard's cocky smirk vanished. He saw something in Daniel's eyes, something dark, something final. Then, without another word, Daniel let him go and stood up. He wiped the blood off his hands, took one last look at Richard's beaten face, and turned toward the door. This wasn't over. Not even close. The hospital waiting room was eerily quiet when Daniel returned. Evelyn shot up from her seat as soon as she saw him, her eyes wide with fear. "Daniel, What did you do? Daniel exhaled deeply, rolling his shoulders. His fists were sore, his knuckles bruised. I gave that bastard what he deserved, he muttered. Evelyn grabbed his arm. You didn't. Daniel, please tell me you didn't kill him. Daniel looked at his sister, his anger still burning beneath his skin. I should have, he admitted darkly. But I didn't. Evelyn let out a shaky sigh of relief. Daniel, violence isn't the answer, she pleaded. I hate Richard for what he did, but we can't let him destroy us. Daniel clenched his jaw. That man nearly killed our mother, Evelyn. He doesn't deserve to breathe. Evelyn wiped at her tears. I know, but Mama needs us now. She doesn't need revenge. She needs healing. Daniel's shoulders slumped. He was so tired. So tired of fighting, so tired of watching his family suffer. At that moment, a nurse walked in. Miss Evelyn? Evelyn and Daniel turned quickly. Yes? Evelyn asked, her heart hammering. The nurse hesitated, then smiled. Your mother is awake. You can see her now. Evelyn felt weak with relief. She turned to Daniel, squeezing his hand. Come on. Let's go see her. Beatrice lay on the hospital bed, her face pale but her eyes bright with emotion as she saw her children enter. My son, she whispered as Daniel rushed to her side. You came? Daniel knelt beside the bed, gripping his mother's frail hand. Mama, I'm so sorry. I should have been there to protect you. Beatrice shook her head. No, my son. This is not your fault. Tears stung Daniel's eyes as he brought his mother's hand to his forehead. I swear, Mama, Richard will pay for what he did to you. Beatrice sighed deeply. My son, revenge will not heal me. Daniel froze. Mama. No, she whispered. I don't want my son to become like him. I want you to be better than him. Evelyn lowered her gaze, touched by her mother's words. Beatrice turned to her daughter. And you, Evelyn, you must let go of the past. Your future is not behind you. Evelyn swallowed hard, placing her hand on her belly. But Mama, what do I do now? I have nowhere to go. Beatrice smiled weakly. You have a baby coming, my child. You must live for them now. Not for Richard. Not for revenge. But for your child. Evelyn let out a choked sob. Her mother was right. She had been holding on to a dead marriage, trying to fix something that was never meant to be saved. For the first time in years, Evelyn realized she had to let go. Daniel, still holding their mother's hand, clenched his jaw. I won't let Richard get away with this, Mama. But I promise, I'll do it the right way. Beatrice smiled. That's all I ask. The three of them sat in silence, letting the weight of everything settle around them. For the first time in a long time, they weren't alone. They still had each other. And that was enough. For now. The next morning, Evelyn stood by the hospital window, staring out at the bustling city below. The sky was clear, the sun casting a warm glow over the streets, but inside, she felt like she was standing in complete darkness. Her mother was resting, and Daniel had gone out to get food, but she couldn't shake the heaviness in her heart. For the first time since being thrown out of Richard's house, she was beginning to realize something she had refused to accept before. She had nothing left to go back to. Richard was never going to change. Her marriage was over. Her home was gone. The life she had once dreamed of was shattered beyond repair. Tears welled up in her eyes as she placed a protective hand over her still swollen belly. What do I do now? She whispered. The thought of raising her child alone terrified her. She had always imagined raising her baby in a home with a loving father, a happy family. But now, all she had was uncertainty and a heart filled with pain. As she stood there, lost in her thoughts, the door creaked open. Evelyn. She turned to see Rachel, her best friend, standing in the doorway. Rachel. Evelyn gasped, rushing toward her. Rachel immediately pulled her into a tight hug. Oh my God, Evelyn, I came as soon as I heard. Are you okay? Evelyn let out a shaky breath as she nodded. I don't know, Rachel. Everything is falling apart. Rachel pulled back, looking her in the eyes. No, Evelyn. Everything is falling into place. You just don't see it yet. Evelyn furrowed her brows. How? How can you say that? Rachel sighed, leading her to a chair. Because you were holding on to something that was never meant to be yours. Richard, that marriage, it was built on pain and suffering. But now, you have a chance to start over. You have a choice. Evelyn blinked at her. A choice?
Yes.
Rachel took her hand. You don't have to stay here.
You don't have to live in the past.
Come with me, Evelyn. Start over. Move to another city. Build a new life for you and your baby. Evelyn stared at her, her heart pounding.
Leave?
Start over? The idea had never crossed her mind before. She had spent so long trying to fix a broken marriage that she never thought about building a new life for herself. Rachel, I don't know, she whispered. Where would I go? What would I do? Rachel smiled. I have a small apartment in Port Harcourt. You can stay with me until you figure things out. You're not alone, Evelyn. You never were. Evelyn felt a lump rise in her throat. For the first time in a long time, she saw a glimmer of hope. Could she really leave everything behind? Could she really start fresh? She looked down at her belly, feeling a gentle kick from her baby. And in that moment, she realized she wasn't just making this decision for herself. She was making it for her child. Taking a deep breath, she looked up at Rachel with newfound determination.
I'll do it, she said.
I'll leave. Rachel's face lit up with joy. That's my girl. Evelyn knew it wouldn't be easy. But for the first time in years, she felt like she was making the right choice. She was choosing herself. She was choosing her baby. She was choosing a new beginning. What will be Evelyn's fate moving to another city with her best friend Rachel? Will she ever birth the child she has been carrying for 2 years? And what would be Richard's reaction after being beaten by Danielle? Stay tuned for part 2. Remember to keep liking and subscribing for more stories coming your way.